So it's Nice 9. What's up? This is my fourth video I've made today. Getting kind of bored of this. Hope you guys can come back soon, because I miss you guys. Well, I don't know you guys, but overall, I miss you guys. So today we're going to finish off Chapter 4. I think it's important that we spend most of the time on First Nations Right Perspective, which is what we did. So today we're going to crank through the rest of it. We're going to talk about Francophone and French and English versus English speaking and reading and education rights. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Métis, specifically the history of the Métis, and Louis Riel, which I think is awesome. As I've mentioned to you before, I love Canadian history. If there was history, not social studies, just history class, I'd be all over it. I would teach that stuff in a heartbeat. But there's not, so I don't get to spend so much time as I would like on history. But we're going to spend a little bit of time today, so I'm excited about that. So, let's go. So, first things first, the Williams video, click there. There's one at the very beginning of this chapter. There's another one, kind of takes you to the halfway point. They're wonderful videos. They really give you an overall perspective of the chapter, so make sure you watch that first before you go any further. So watch that and then come back. Okay. So, now we're going to talk about what collective rights do official language groups have under the Charter. So official language groups would be Francophones and Anglophones, okay? So what are the collective rights of them and then Charter of Rights and Freedoms? How do their collective rights affect their quality of life? And what are the backgrounds and histories of those official language communities here in Canada? So just imagine for a second, you have moved to a foreign country, and upon your arrival, you realize that you are the only person that you can see with your ethnic, culture, religious, and language group to be seen. The country that you're living in is not racist or discriminatory in any way, shape, or form, but you'll probably feel a little strange, right? You are accepted part of this community, but what would it feel like, right? You can't talk to anybody. You don't see anybody that looks the same as you. Your school's in a different language. How might this affect your daily activities, right? Probably like living in COVID. You probably wouldn't see anybody. How would this impact your quality of life? And that's important to understand. That's why we have these collective rights in the Charter, is so that people that across the country that speak English or French don't feel like this. They have opportunities to speak and learn and be part of their own language groups. So, under the Charter, we are an official bilingual country. And you know that, right? We're, I think, the only one in the world where we have two official languages. And those are established in Section 16 to 20 of the Charter. You don't need to know that. Both languages have the right to conduct affairs of the federal government in either official language. So you in Alberta here, if you call the Parliament building here in Edmonton and you only speak French, someone there will speak French for you, right? The only official bilingual province is New Brunswick, right? So even though we're a bilingual country, Alberta is predominantly an English-speaking country. Or province, I should say. Same with BC, same as Saskatchewan. Quebec is obviously a French-speaking province. New Brunswick is a bilingual province, but even though the country is bilingual. I want to make sure I didn't miss page. Okay, cool. Now, under Section 23 of the Charter, any minority-speaking population of sufficient size has the right to be publicly funded schools that serve their language community, right? So there are schools in Edmonton that are French-speaking schools, but honestly the best example is a little town just south of Edmonton. I'm sure many of you have been there, called Beaumont, Alberta. They got the big hill and the big church. If you go through there, you'll notice that all the stop signs are French. All the signs are in French. Their schools are predominantly French-speaking, because that is it's not as much anymore. The town has changed a lot in my lifetime, because it's significantly closer to Edmonton now than it was when I was a kid. But it is predominantly a French-speaking community, or at least it was at one point, right? So they had French schools there. That is their right. They had enough population to have a publicly funded school that serves their language community, which was French. So just real quick history here. You never get tested on this, which I think is a shame, but you should know that Canada was founded by the French, right? So French was our first language. Samuel Champlain, he founds Quebec City, establishes New France. 1774, Britain has taken over, they've won. They passed the Quebec Act, recognizing the rights of the French that already live here, right? So instead of just kicking them out, they just said, yeah, we recognize it, you can stay here, and we recognize your right to be French. 1867, that's a big date. If you have to remember two dates, that's one of them. 1867 is the year Confederation establishes Canada as a bilingual nation. That's when Canada became Canada. 1969, Official Languages Act reasserts the equality of French and English in Canada. And the other second date that I think you really need to know is 1982. This was the year the Charter of Rights and Freedoms confirms official bilingualism. And some people would argue, and I would too, even though Canada was established in 1867, it really became its own country in 1982, because that's when we officially split from Britain. We had our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? Up until then, we just used England's, right? So we established our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms that confirmed our official bilingualism, and obviously many other things in 1982. So how has the Charter affected Francophone education? Francophones and Anglophones were made possible in Confederation. Guarantees, there's a BNA Act in 1867, which is part of the year of Confederation, which established Canada as a bilingual act, guaranteed money for minority schools anywhere in Canada, right? So now, traditionally, not so much nowadays, but traditionally, if you were Protestant, you were English, and that meant you could have those schools in Quebec, even though it was a French-speaking province. And if you were Catholic/French, that meant you could have a school in the rest of Canada. Now, we're a Catholic school. We're not a French school, so that's obviously a little bit different now. But, in 1867, that's predominantly what it was. If you were English, you were Protestant. If you were French, you were Catholic. And this BNA Act, under Confederation, guaranteed that you could have money for your school no matter where you were. Real quick, I want you to turn to page 147 and give these a quick read. The Manitoba School Act, and a word I'm going to butcher, the Houghton Resolution and Northwest Territories Ordinance number 22 Act. Just give those a read and then come back and ask yourself this question. In what ways did these acts call the founding principles of Confederation into question? Hopefully what you'll understand is, like, even though in 1890 and 1892 we were a confederation, we were guaranteed these rights, the Manitoba Schools Act and this other one, the Houghton Resolution, just basically came and said, nope, in Manitoba, we're English. Nope, in Northern Territories, we're English. Well, that goes completely against the collective rights that were established in 1867. Now, today, we still have language minority education. So in 1982, like I told you, we had the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was established by Trudeau, which is funny enough to say. He used that as an opportunity to restore education rights. So if you look on page 148, you can see those results. I'm not going to make you look at it, but you can have a quick boo if you want. Okay? So we still have those minority rights. Okay? But now it gets a little tricky sometimes when we get into Quebec. So in Quebec, they have something called Bill 101. So in 1977, provincial government of Quebec passed Bill 101 to establish rules to protect French language in Quebec. Essentially, what they saw happening was, we have American media, we have English Canadian media, everything that's popular in North America comes through in English, right? So if you're surrounded by English, eventually you become what you see all the time. So the government wanted to protect their French language and French identity, so they passed Bill 101 that basically said the official language of business government education in Quebec is French. You can still have English, but signs, government, everything has to be in French first. French has got to be the more predominant language that you see everywhere, right? And the reason that was to protect their own language and culture, because they saw what was happening, right? And I mean, if you think about it, if they hadn't done something like this, you'd see way more English in Quebec nowadays than you probably would see French. Moving on, so that's Francophone and Anglophone. We're going to talk about Métis real quick. So some terms you should know. These are all on the term sheet that I gave at the very beginning of this chapter. So what laws recognize the collective rights of Métis? So a Métis is a descendant of mixed First Nations and European, usually French heritage, right? So we had French explorers coming west across Canada. They meet up with some First Nations people, get along real well, end up staying, end up making families, having children, and those people became the Métis. Inherent rights are rights with origins of fundamental justice, rights associated with history and tradition, right? So something that has historically been a right or tradition that you have. Scrip is a document that can be exchanged from the Métis for land. So it's kind of like money, but worthless to the vast majority of people, but they use it as money. And autonomy is the authority to make decisions, right? So again, the government at some point takes the autonomy to make decisions, even though they don't consult with anybody. So know those terms, okay? So, Métis rights, how did they get where they are today? The biggest thing I need you to know is Louis Riel. He is known as the father of Confederation. So he was in Manitoba. He was a resistance leader. Click on that history minute for a second there. I'll kind of give you a brief little overview. It's actually done by kids. It's like a little media thing, got a moving mouth thing. It's like 2 minutes long. It's actually kind of funny, but it's really informative. It might not be the most appropriate thing, but it's actually really informative and really well done. So Louis Riel led the Northwest resistance, which ended in military conflict between the Métis government and the Canadian government. The Canadian government, the reason they did not respond to Métis request petitions for land and collective rights, right? Essentially, they saw like why we have traditional lands. We've been around forever. We're not First Nations. We're not European. We're kind of in between. We should get some land and collective rights to protect our identity. And the Canadian government said, we're not listening. Forget it. We're not listening to you. So Louis Riel led this resistance. He's considered the founder of Manitoba. They had some conflict with the Canadian government. The Canadian government sent the army. Obviously, the Canadian government won. They hung Louis Riel for treason in 1885. That's a Canadian government made historic a minute. Give that click on the link there, and that'll be really good. Now, back in the day, obviously, if you were English, you're like, yeah, Louis Riel, let's hang that guy. He's going against Confederation. But if you were French or you were Métis, you saw it as a betrayal of French-English alliance, right? Like we had these rules. We made all this. We have Confederation. We're supposed to be officially English and French. We have these number trees of all these things, and government, you're not listening to it. You're not obeying the rules that you set out, and you were so upset at this one guy that you hung him. Right, so that made for a real conflict in Canadian history, which is why he's considered one of the founders of Manitoba. And I think in the last 10 years ago, he was actually the Canadian government came out and said, we're sorry. And they, because he was branded as a traitor for a long time, and they actually took that back. So that's that today. That'll finish Chapter 4 in terms of the book. We will continue on Chapter 4 next week. But we're going to have a couple major assignments next week. You're going to be writing, not writing an essay, but kind of putting together pieces of an essay. We're going to watch a movie next week. Hopefully your internet works enough that you can watch it. We're going to try. And then I've got just a review package for you to work on. So, as always, contact me if you have any questions or concerns. Have a great weekend, you guys.